My guest today is Sebastian Junger, best-selling author, award-winning journalist, and one of the most influential documentary filmmakers of the modern war era. I don't think a lot of people would argue with me on that. For more than 2 decades, he is embedded with soldiers on the front lines, really chronicling kind of the raw, unfiltered reality of combat and the human bonds that form in the crucible of war. His Oscar-nominated film Restrepo, which was the first one that I saw, and its companion Korengal set a new standard for authenticity in war storytelling. And his books, From the Perfect Storm to Tribe to Freedom, explore what drives people to risk everything for purpose, community, and meaning. And now in his new Netflix documentary, Marines, Sebastian turns his lens on a different kind of battlefield, not the firefights of Afghanistan, but the psychological and cultural terrain of today's Marine Corps. At a moment when America's young recruits are preparing for a future conflict that may look nothing like the wars of the last generation, Marines examines identity, duty, and the search for purpose inside one of the world's most storied military institutions. Sebastian Junger, welcome. It's such an honor to have you here.
Thank you, and thank you for that description of me. I'm very flattered.
Yeah, well, I have been following you for years. I don't think we've had the chance to meet before, but your work obviously has an incredible reputation in the community, and I'm interested to kind of dig in. You know, I have to tell you, Marines isn't entirely what I expected. As a daughter and granddaughter of Marines in World War II and Vietnam, I kind of expected a history of the Marine Corps, and that's not what we got. What we got was something very personal, very raw. We were following instead with this particular documentary a group of Marines that were preparing for a very consequential test. I'd love to hear from you a little bit about the thinking that went into approaching it from that perspective.
Yeah, so I was brought in after the inception of the project as a sort of consultant, and a close friend of one of the producers, Katie Gilbert, who was in on the ground floor. And so, I was with the 173rd Airborne, not the Marines, but there's a lot of commonalities, of course, and they're really both sort of cutting edge units, cutting edge forces, and that go in first. And so I think the thinking was that there's a possibility of a large scale confrontation with a world power, China specifically. The U.S. has fought small scale wars. Even Vietnam was comparatively small scale compared to World War II, and had sort of mixed success. But what would happen if we had to fight a military peer like China or Russia? And how would we prepare? And it's the Marines that would sort of take the initial brunt of the fighting, and I think probably absorb enormous casualties. And so the military is preparing an expeditionary force that could conceivably land in Asia and establish a beachhead for the rest of the U.S. military to follow. That would be the Marines, a Marine Expeditionary Unit. So what we wanted to do was show the preparations for such an eventuality. Hopefully that never happens, of course. And how do you take 18-year-olds, 19-year-olds and prepare them, not to sort of land in Baghdad and do their thing in Afghanistan, but really to confront a global superpower on their own continent, like as we did in World War II. What does that look like? What do you have to do to these young men and women to prepare them for that?
Yeah, and I thought that was really fascinating. And I really, the characters, like in any great documentary, you really get connected to them. You relate to them, even if they're someone completely out of anyone you've ever dealt with in your life. There's a raw humanity there that I think really comes out in the Marines. You've long argued in many of your earlier works that combat often doesn't prepare people for what comes next. The real challenge of reintegrating into a civilian world that lacks tribal belonging and meaningful purpose. I think we all remember that scene from The Hurt Locker where Jeremy Renner's character comes home, tries to connect with his child, goes to the grocery store, completely overwhelmed. Mundane tasks just seem like they have no purpose. You've talked about this a lot in your prior work too, Sebastian, and I'm wondering, how do you think these things are different now? Because some of the Marines you follow in the documentary really want to go to war. That's what they signed up for. And it doesn't quite work out for them. They end up going home. Is it a different kind of struggle for these folks?
Well, it's the same struggle we all face in a sense. We humans are social primates. We are wired to exist and face hardship and danger and adversity and survive and recover from trauma in small groups, right? That's what we're wired for. Groups of 30, 40, 50 people, typically for most of our human evolution, our human history. So what happens with the military, particularly in combat, most of the military does not see combat, right? But even those people function very intensely for a 1 year deployment. Um, Function very intensely with small groups of people, just like in our evolutionary past. That feels very, very good, right? We are wired to confront these terrible situations in a group and recover from them in a group. We continue on as humans in that same survival group. What's different about the modern era, with all its benefits, right? I mean, of course, the modern society is a miracle in many ways. But one of the things we give up is that we don't go through life's adversities with a group of other people, a survival group, maybe our family if we're lucky, but otherwise it's a kind of wide open society, and that is difficult for everybody. The depression rate, the suicide rate, the anxiety rate, the addiction rate in affluent society is far higher than in impoverished societies around the world. The Marines, the soldiers I was with, they experience this intense communality, and then they come back to what we all are struggling in, which is a very unconnected society. And of course, the psychological consequences arrive very, very swiftly for those people.
Yeah, and the suicide is a major problem in the military that I think a lot of people who don't follow this, like you do, and like the Cipher Brief doesn't really understand how big of a problem that is. In the documentary, we follow one of your characters who decides to come back to his small hometown, and he's not really sure what's next. I'm wondering, based on all the work you've done on this, based on your work tribe, and the folks you've met and talked to over the years, how did that particular scene and that storyline kind of affect you? And what were you thinking in the back of your mind as that was unfolding on the screen?
Well, I just know many, many. The unit I was with was all men, so I'm going to have to say I know many, many men from that unit that I was embedded with, who came back and had the exact same struggle. Um, but to go a little broader, right? Because this is ultimately a universal struggle. People who are in the Peace Corps for 2 years, typically in a remote community in an impoverished nation, come back and suffer a 25% rate of serious depression when they come home, right? Um, People that do all kinds of gig work, oil workers, people who work on fishing boats, film crews, right? People that are tightly bonded with others to do a very intense task and then are sort of released to go back home. Um, they're surrounded by people who didn't have the same experience, right? And as humans, we're wired to affiliate with people that share our experiences. You went through the Blitz in London with some other people. Those are your kin. Emotionally speaking, those are your kin. This is a huge, wonderful, amazing country. Our men and women in uniform are drawn from small towns and big cities from all over the country. But it may be that when you come home, you may be the only person in your neighborhood, in your town, who served recently. You are alone. We're not wired for that. They have done experiments with chimpanzees, our closest relatives genetically, um, where they're isolated from their peer group, and it's psychologically crippling for them. And that's exactly what happens to people that come, young people who have worked hard in the Marines or wherever, and they come back to their hometown and they don't relate to anyone because no one had the same experience. It's very, very difficult.
Is there an answer? Is there a solution to this, do you think? I mean, I know you spent years focused on it.
I mean, the solution would be a societal level solution for everybody, right? I mean, you can't create a sort of micro communities for veterans and not have wider communities for everybody. They're coming home, right? I mean, they're coming back to this society. If they're coming back to something that feels like close community, it's going to be something that it's going to be a novel society that we would all also benefit from because it is close. Um, I think there are communities in this country that function that way. I live in a mixed income community in the Lower East Side of Manhattan, And it's quite close, I got to say. It's not a village, but it's like there's some real familiarity and closeness with other people that feels absolutely wonderful. But I grew up in an affluent suburb, and the emotional deserts of an affluent or a middle class town in America are really pretty intense. They're psychologically very, very hard. And if you look at the rates of depression and anxiety and suicide in high school kids, you can see that playing out very, very clearly. Well, of course, that happens with veterans as well. So no short answer. No, there is not a quick solution. I think there's a long-term solution. I think the society will have to fundamentally restructure itself in order to make it essentially more human.
Yeah, which is definitely a tall order.
Yeah,
And it does show itself, in the fact that a lot of us, many of us don't know our neighbors very well
yeah.
anymore. And there are people who literally live right next door, sometimes for decades. I want to go back to something we talked about just off the top, where we're focusing on Marines, which is the new Netflix documentary. And we're talking about the future kind of war. These Marines are preparing for what may come, which is conflict with China, which is in the headlines almost every day now. And certainly at the Cipher Brief, we're watching that very closely. With the US kind of pivoting more now toward these great power competitions and the hybrid threats, the things like information warfare, cyber, all these things happening in the gray zone. Sebastian, I'm wondering how you're thinking about meaning of service and really the motivation for new recruits. Are their roles going to change over time?
Well, the Marines just dismantled their sniper program, right? So, I mean, I don't know what the thinking was behind that, and of course, there were a lot of upset snipers. But so clearly, things are changing. I don't have access to high-level strategic military thought, right? I don't have access to that. But clearly, the Pentagon is watching the war in Ukraine very, very carefully. It's an example of a new form of warfare where drones predominate and really are more powerful than the infantrymen. And I, I don't think anyone knows how this is going to play out, but obviously it's something they're watching. I mean, when you have drones the size of a coffee cup that can be flown miles and into the hatch of a tank, that's almost the finger of God coming down to destroy people. Like it has that kind of omnipresent power. It would feel that way. I think it must be absolutely psychologically incapacitating to soldiers on the ground. I remember when I was in combat, you always had the feeling if you get low enough and behind something, you were good, right? They're shooting at you, get behind something. They're shelling you, get low, right? And that gets you through an awful lot of stuff. With drones, there is no such thing. There is no hiding place. And I think the psychological stresses of that risk being crippling.
Yeah. We've spent time in Ukraine as well with the Nemesis Battalion, which is now the drone battalion over there. And it is a very different psychology and mentality, and how those folks who are fighting in that war and those drone pilots are coming together almost like a video game type scenario where they're even being rewarded for confirmed kills and damaging Russian vehicles and things like that, which is very different. So I wonder if some of these same themes that you've talked about and that you've addressed in your previous books and even in Marines, if that's something that's just going to portray itself slightly differently in the future. It's a whole new world. Does it worry you?
Well, a lot of, yeah. I mean, a lot. I'm the father of two young daughters, 8 and 5, and an enormous number of things worry me right now. Right, partly just from being a parent, but yeah. I mean, as far as the U.S. military goes, we're a stabilizing force in the world when we're not disrupting it, but largely we're a stabilizing force in the world, and I think I think what would be, I know, I was I studied anthropology in college, we know from chimpanzee society that when you remove the alpha male, there's a eh, there's a rise in violence in the group. It doesn't go down. I mean, alpha males use violence to control the group. When you take out the alpha male, there's a rise in violence. And one of the things that might happen in the world is that the U.S. has in military terms has been the sort of alpha male of the planet for since World War II, and we may that may end soon. And if it ends, there's I think a great possibility that, as in chimpanzee society, there's an outbreak of increased violence in the world until a new hierarchy is established, and then things calm down again. That would be, I imagine, that would be a very, very painful process, and we have to do everything we can to avoid that. It will be absolutely horrible for humanity.
You're seeing, things play out with the rise of authoritarianism around the world as well, and that's deeply concerning. One of the things too, I just want to switch gears for 1 second that we talk about, and you're going to give me a lot to think about with that topic. The generational differences. How much do you think that's kind of playing into, the Marines that you would have talked to from the Vietnam era? Do you think there were similarities with these kids that are portrayed in Marines?
Well, the big dividing line, look, we're humans. We don't change biologically, we don't change generation to generation. Culturally, a little bit. But the big dividing line is, have you been in combat or not in combat? I think everyone who's been in combat becomes quite similar to everyone else who's ever been in combat, right? It's a very, very similar atavistic mindset. It's survival oriented. It's affiliation oriented. You affiliate with others because that's where your survival lies, is in your brothers and sisters, right? And you return from that change. If you haven't been in combat, you might experience some of those reactions to being in very intense training with others, right? But it's not going to be quite what it was if you were in the real deal. And so our subjects in Marines were not combat tested, right? They'd been very well trained. They were ready to go, like every generation of warfighters is, but they had not been in it and come out the other side. So it's hard to distinguish for me the generational differences from the experiential differences. I just don't know which is which. When I was in Eastern Afghanistan, embedded with the 173rd Airborne, there was no internet connection where we were. It was a small outpost. No communication with the outside world. None, except by radio to the company headquarters and the battalion, right? No internet, no cell phone service, no talking to your girlfriend, but whatever, like, done. Absolutely. So that, I think, would be quite unimaginable for even this generation, 20 years on, this generation of young people. I think that might be really kind of bewildering for them.
That connectivity issue, for sure. Were there any things that, if you could go back, you've done this for decades now, you've focused on these things as a journalist, as a documentary maker, as an author. Are there any things that you would go back and tell 20-year ago Sebastian Junger today about what you were going to learn? I mean, are there big lessons here that have changed you as a person?
Well, yeah, I think the thing that I don't know what I would tell myself, but I think that what surprised me was I'd been in a lot of combat before the U.S. was at war, right? I was in civil wars in West Africa. I was in Afghanistan in the 90s. I was in Bosnia in 93. So my experience of wartime was with, non-Americans, right? And often not speaking the language. I was amazed when I was with American troops how deep those bonds were, not just between each other, but between me and them. I wasn't a soldier. I carried a video camera. But I was with this platoon off and on for a year. I got very, very close to all those guys. And the main trauma, to my real puzzlement, I don't even want to call it trauma, the main difficulty coming back from that wasn't that we'd been shot at a whole lot. That's easy. Like, that's nothing, right? I never saw a friend get killed. I think that's very traumatizing. But just the experience of combat is not, for me, it wasn't that big a deal. It was the loss of that, I'm going to call it kinship, that brotherhood. It was the straight up loss of that community, even as a civilian, an older civilian with a video camera. It even affected me. And I came home and I was just bewildered by this sense of dislocation and loss and depression. And it was so intense that even my wife looked like a stranger to me. Like, who are you? What are we doing together? I mean, it was really disorienting. And I was in my 40s. I can't imagine having that experience at 22 and coming back without 40 years of life experience behind you, just 20 years, a few years of adulthood. I would be incredibly disorienting. And so I think the thing that people must understand is that when soldiers and when men and women in service struggle when they come home, they're grieving. They're not necessarily traumatized. They might just be grieving the loss of this essential human experience, which is connection, a connection with people you depend on for your survival, which goes way beyond whether you know your neighbors or not, right? It's good to know your neighbors. I'm not knocking that. But that doesn't even begin to describe the kind of human bond that typifies the human experience. And now we no longer have that. And it's very, very hard to come back to that realization.
Yeah, from someone who served in war zones as a journalist as well, I completely understand what you're talking about. It is, you belong to a group of people that no one in your other life understands. It's definitely essential and core to a lot of the depression and the suicides and things that we talked about a little bit earlier. I'm wondering, like, what do you, when you and your family get together over the holidays and things and you talk in your extended family, do you talk about these things? Do you talk about your work? Do you talk about the Marines, the documentaries you're doing, the books? Like, what's it like at your house?
Well, I've got, as I said, young daughters, 8 and 5, and I sheltered them a little bit from some of the realities of the world. They know that I've been in combat.
Yeah.
They didn't know I was working on this particular series, but they know that I've been in combat. They've seen photos of me. They've heard me answering questions on podcasts like this. We live in a very small apartment where there are no secrets, basically, right, in New York City. So that they know that, and they're quite. My older daughter is quite curious about that, but I explain. She thinks I was in the military. I keep saying no, I wasn't in the military. I was with the military, but that's not a distinction she, like makes. And I think probably what affected them more was that having dodged a lot of bullets, I stopped war reporting after my colleague and my brother, my friend Tim Hetherington. I made Restrepo with Tim. He was killed in Libya in 2011. I got out of war reporting after that, and had a very significant life change after that. And but then I almost died from a sort of freak medical event a few years ago. I had an undiagnosed aneurysm in my pancreatic artery, and it ruptured just in mid-sentence. After decades of this thing growing, they're silent killers. It ruptured, and I bled out into my own abdomen. I lost half my blood, and I almost died. I mean, I should have died. I came very close to dying. They know that. They know that Daddy almost died from a medical situation like that. They know it's not combat, but they know they experienced the reality that that one's parents are mortal and they will die one day, and they experienced that and they understood that to be true at a very young age, and probably, hey, look, that's the truth, that's reality, right? I think it was probably a good thing for them, but it certainly was complicated. If for the children of men and women in uniform who are in combat, I can't imagine how hard that is to know that daddy or mommy is going to a war zone and might not come back. And some people's parents don't come back. And to know that as a child, I can't imagine the pain and the anxiety of that. I can't even think about it.
Yeah, I would say if there's only one upside, and maybe this is coming from me being a mom, is that it develops empathy in you and in a true sense of value, the value of the time that you have, the life that you have with the people you love.
Yeah.
Sebastian Junger, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you this morning. I wish we had more time. I know that, well, you've got a busy day ahead of you, but it's been such a pleasure. I really appreciate your insights into this and to broaden your body of work over the course of your career and into the new documentary that's out on Netflix now called Marines. I hope we get to connect again soon.
Anytime, I would love to. Thank you very much for having me.